Chapter 351, Game of Question and Answer. After a full half-hour of uninterrupted silence, Klein opened his eyes and slowly rose to his feet. He took his cane, put on his hat, and left the cathedral, taking a rental carriage back to Minsk Street in the dark. At this moment, the vigilance and surveillance of the surrounding area had inevitably relaxed, turning into the shadows under the light of the gas lamps. Shortly after midnight, Klein took out his key, opened the door to his house, and entered the empty guest rooms to search for the Book of Secrets. It didn't take him much effort to find the old book, bound in thick goatskin, in the wardrobe in a room on the first floor. The hardcover of the book was dark black, with 2 lines of Hermes written in crimson, Book of Secrets. Klarman. Phew. Klein exhaled but was in no rush to read the book. Instead, he quickly constructed a wall of spirituality in the room, summoning and responding to himself via a ritual, and then he threw Azek's copper whistle, the master key, the all-black eye, the Beyonder bullets, the bottle of biological poison, the werewolf Beyonder characteristic, the Book of Secrets, and even all the vessels above the gray fog. He planned on waiting for the commotion to subside before deciding on which to take out and which to carry. After doing all this, he didn't even bother to study the werewolf Beyonder characteristic or the bottle of biological poison. He simply washed up and laid in bed. There were 2 reasons for doing so. Firstly, reading the book was too time-consuming. It was very easy to bring trouble to his body in the real world on this rather uncalm night. Secondly, Klein was aware of his current weakness, which was that the speed at which his spirituality was growing wasn't enough to satisfy his ever-increasing Beyonder powers and mystical items. After such an intense battle, his spirituality was already drained, his head was aching, and he was drowsy.
Yes, the one thing that places the greatest burden on my spirituality are the paper figurine substitutes, followed by the creation of sun holy water with the sun brooch, but it wasn't used tonight. Next in the list is holy water creation and flaming jump.
Klein yawned and used cogitation to get rid of the state of extreme tiredness and tenseness that prevented him from falling asleep. In less than 10 seconds, he entered the land of dreams as various fragmented scenes appeared alternately before him. In the clearing surrounded by the abandoned warehouses, the machinery hive mind came and went before coming again. The person in charge of investigating this incident went from being a team captain to an expert at the rank of deacon. Icancer Bernard's brown hair remained unkempt and stuck out stubbornly, making it impossible to hide them even with a hat on. This led to many members of the machinery hive mind to secretly joke that the deacon probably used a bomb to style his hair. At this moment, Icancer, with his cut jaw and facial features, was holding a silver mirror with ancient patterns on it. On each side of the mirror was an eye-like ornament. They were built on the foundation of a black gem which looked serene and charming. My Fidjik, Icancer surveyed the area and said,
Although the rats in the sewers are experts at interfering with divination and mediumship and had already dealt with the scene effectively, this is a mysterious Beyonder world, and there is no way to guarantee a 100% success.
As he spoke, he looked at the silver mirror in his hand as he used his right hand to touch its surface thrice. After pausing for 2 seconds, Icancer took a deep breath and said in a deep voice,
Honorable Herodes, my question is, who were the participants in the incident that just happened here?
The surrounding darkness suddenly thickened, and the surface of the silver mirror began to ripple with aqueous light. Soon, a scene appeared in the silver mirror. Amidst the rising flames, there was a figure floating in the air. He was wearing a black double-breasted frock coat and a half-top hat. His body was distorted, and his face was indistinct. Furthermore, his face was smeared with paint. Beneath his feet, flames rose up and engulfed him. As the aqueous light flashed, the scene changed. A middle-aged man in a dark red cloak appeared. His arm was burning with resplendent flames, but his head was hidden in the darkness. Scene after scene was played out in front of their eyes. They saw a woman with a complicated black regal dress and messy blonde hair. However, her face was completely transparent, as if she didn't exist. Beside this lady were two men with black fur all over their bodies. Only their backs could be seen as they were being pulled by strange arms. Finally, the changes came to an end as it fixed onto the blazing flames that soared into the sky. The fireworks bloomed in a splendid and resplendent fashion as they lit up the entire scene. In this dreamlike scene, the man in the black, double-breasted frock coat appeared once again. Twisting and retracting, he faced forward, pressed his hat to his chest, and bowed slightly. Not only was his face extremely blurry after being interfered with, but it also presented a glisten of oil. Just as Cancer was about to ask his teammates for their opinions, several lines of text in ancient Fasak appeared on the surface of the mirror.
Based on the principle of reciprocity, it's my turn to ask the question. If you answer wrong or lie, you will be punished.
The word punished was blood red, as if it were dripping with liquid. The expression on Ikansei's face was twisted at first, before it turned abnormally serious. Soon after, the mirror's aqueous light flashed, and a new line of text appeared.
What's your sexual orientation?
Ikanser was stunned as he felt the gazes of his surrounding team members all land on him. 6 in the morning. The sky was just beginning to brighten. The sleeping Klein awoke to the punctual church bells. According to his usual habits, he would just turn around and continue sleeping until it was almost 8 o'clock. But this time, he immediately sat up and looked around.
Yeah, I didn't get rated on the pretext of checking my gas meter.
He let out a sigh of relief, and without even bothering to clean himself, he got off the bed and took 4 steps counterclockwise to go above the gray fog. He wanted to study his spoils from last night. Sitting in the fool's seat, Klein started from the simplest. He picked up the dark green fang and observed it for a few seconds. Then he conjured a pen and paper and wrote the divination sentence.
Its effects.
This didn't mean that divination could be used as a substitute for experimentation. With the fact that he held the item in his possession, and how he knew a lot about prisoner, lunatic, and werewolf from Sharon and Merrick, he believed that it was enough for him to attempt to gain some revelations from it. After reciting the statement, he quickly entered the dreamland and witnessed one scene after another. A vicious wound appeared on Werewolf Tyre's stomach, and his intestines flowed out as they were dragged across the ground. However, he only washed it with water and stuffed the intestines back into his stomach. He pinched both sides of the wound, and in the end, the wound actually healed. Under the perfect red moon, he faced the sky and let out a long howl. Black fur grew out of his body inch by inch, and the fangs in his mouth were distinct. He waved his claws and cracked the steel plate that wasn't considered thin. He ran wildly through the wilderness, increasing the gap between him and the group of pursuing gray wolves as he ran further and further away. He made the attendants, whose eyes were glazed but cold, charge at their enemies without fear of death. He also used a variety of weapons to kill people, including bombs, and he became stronger as he lost his reasoning while in his enraged state. Opening his eyes, Klein roughly understood the characteristics of a werewolf and grasped the hidden dangers of this beyonder characteristic. Werewolf Tyre had been under the full moon's illumination, allowing him to be unrestrained towards his desires. After his death, he left a relatively strong spiritual mark, so those beyonders who would use this beyonder characteristic to concoct a potion to advance themselves to the next sequence had to resist this kind of effect at an early stage. Otherwise, they would show signs of losing control. However, the negative effects had yet to reach the level of a sealed artifact, and the beyonder characteristic left behind by the werewolf could still be used as the main ingredient for a potion.
That's good. Unfortunately, Zombie Jason's beyonder characteristic has been swallowed by that strange door. I wonder where it leads to, and if there's a way to get it back.
Klein put down the dark green fang, feeling both regret and sadness for his loss, before picking up the bottom of brown, translucent biological poison. He repeated the same procedure and performed a dream divination, but this time he didn't have the confidence to gain a detailed revelation. Therefore, he changed the divination statement to,
its positive and negative effects.
"In the gray gloom of the dream world, Klein once again saw tragic scenes. Someone fell to the ground, scratching himself and ripping off his skin, flesh, and even bones. Another person held his head, his eyes losing focus while his auras weakened. One kept vomiting. Towards the end, the person who died was convulsing. Someone burst out laughing so hard that he couldn't even breathe. Some people stopped fighting and looked at each other. Then they hugged and kissed each other. When the scene reached the end, the translucent brown bottle was placed into a cup with water. The transparent liquid inside gradually turned amber in color and was drunk. The person holding onto the bottle of biological poison was weakened at first before coughing. Then he touched his forehead. He found himself scalding as his condition turned for the worse. The dream quickly ended. Klein tapped his finger on the edge of the long table as he attempted to interpret the revelation with great difficulty.
According to Steve, the earlier revelations mean that after the biological poison's bottle lid is removed, it would keep emanating its poison. As for which poison the opponent gets inflicted by, it's completely random, and even the wielder is unable to control it. The poison inside is really quite abominable. The effective range of the poison cannot be deciphered via a revelation. Soaking it in water and drinking the amber liquid in advance would prevent one from getting poisoned? But how many minutes should the soaking take? Even if the person holding the biological poison bottle doesn't open the lid, their bodies would get worse as they slowly get infected. And the ailments become serious? What's the exact cutoff time?
Klein rubbed his forehead, intending to do some experiments above the gray fog when he was free, but he didn't know if the biological poison bottle was effective in there. For example, in his current spirit-body state, he wasn't afraid of being poisoned at all.
I'll leave it at this. I'll study it in detail in the future.
Klein turned his attention to the Book of Secrets, which was bound in goatskin. He then casually flipped to the first page. It was a title page with simple patterns on it, but with nothing written on it. Flipping another page, Klein finally saw the opening line of the Book of Secrets.
We worship the moon, not the Evernight goddess.
Chapter 352, Breakfast. Another statement about only worshiping the moon and not the goddess? Klein couldn't help but have a look of contemplation. The last time he heard about such matters was when he was learning about the life school of thought. He never expected that the shaman king, who had lived his entire life in the southern continent, would also have a similar point of view. In the Pale Era, at the end of the Fourth Epoch, the Berserk Sea became a veritable reality. Thus, the northern and southern continent were cut off from each other, and the life school of thought was formed in the early Fifth Epoch. Obviously, it was impossible for the life school of thought to extend itself to the southern continent before Roselle sent his men to find a safe sea route. Shaman King Klarman was a historical figure who was active in an era more than 1,000 years before the northern continent's invasion. In other words, the two Beyonder factions, which were in different continents, had no way of communicating with each other and had chosen to worship the moon itself and ignore the Evernight goddess at almost the same period of time. Such a coincidence inadvertently made one consider why. Could it be that the birth of a new god had taken away a portion of the authority related to the moon? But as a deity, he shouldn't be so obscure and unknown. In other words, although the goddess had snatched the authority of the moon, the followers of the primordial moon god had survived. They had been passed down from the Fourth Epoch, or even the Third Epoch. Even after the separation of the northern continent and southern continent, they blossomed into two groups, one helmed by the Shaman King, the other by the life school of thought. Klein made a rough guess, but he was troubled by the lack of clues to narrow the scope. He gave up thinking about it for the time being and quickly skimmed through the rest of the contents of the Book of Secrets. In the preamble, Shaman King Klarman said, very directly, that many of the rituals, deeds, astromancy, and summoning techniques in the book had originated from a primitive worship of the moon and described the corresponding honorific names in detail. The one and only red moon, the symbol of life and beauty, the mother of all spiritual forces. There's actually an honorific name. However, it lacks the more popular descriptions like those of the Evernight goddess or Earth Mother. If there really is such a hidden God, his followers would inevitably develop a simpler title to address him that's more suitable for praise than the worship of the primordial moon. Klein sensed something amiss as he began to analyze it with his own knowledge on mysticism. Besides, using the Lady of Crimson to hold a ritual would very obviously direct it at the goddess. But using an honorific name, which is very similar but more detailed, would circumvent the goddess, pointing it to the source of their power, the primordial moon.
I wonder what arcane existence it is.
Klein thought with wonder and alarm. Due to his lack of time, he skimmed through the details and found that, as Shaman King Klarman had said so himself, many of the deeds and rituals were directed at the moon. For Klein, it wasn't a cause for concern. He didn't plan on copying them wholesale and end up provoking the primordial moon, which he had no idea about. What he wanted to learn was the overall structure, design, and details of the deeds and rituals. Only by mastering the underlying rules could he come up with his own secret deeds, rituals, astromancy, and summoning techniques that pointed to the king of yellow and black.
Perhaps in the far future I'll have my own mysticism system.
Klein removed the spirit pendulum from his wrist and finally confirmed the authenticity of the Book of Secrets. After receiving a clear answer, he was in no hurry to use the werewolf's beyonder characteristic to divine a formula. After all, he wasn't able to sell it, and for the same reason, he decided to delay the research of the biological poison bottle for a while. He quickly returned to the real world and drew the curtains. He saw the sun, which wasn't capable of illuminating the land. It was hidden behind the clouds and fog, looking somewhat pale. Achoo! Suddenly, Klein covered his nose and mouth, and he sneezed. Only then did he realize that his head was aching and burning. He felt lightheaded and had seemingly caught a cold.
I actually fell ill as a Sequence 7 Beyonder.
Klein pulled out a piece of paper and sniffed. He carefully thought back for a moment and quickly understood the reason. The negative effects of the biological poison bottle would gradually weaken the possessor and result in an illness. If it was carried around even longer, then it might even lead to death, and this effect couldn't be eliminated with the use of spirituality seals. Last night, Klein's spirituality was almost nearly emptied after the battle. While his body was still weak from the poison, he still carried the biological poison bottle with him and hid in Lever Cathedral for half an hour. Adding the time spent on his return to Minsk Street, and he had embarrassingly fallen ill.
Thankfully, it's not serious. It doesn't affect anything.
Klein sneezed again as he prepared to soak himself in a hot bath. After washing his face and rinsing his mouth, he specially fried an egg to reward himself. The fragrance was truly tantalizing.
A Shaman King's Book of Secrets, and the biological poison bottle, a mystical item that's not worse than the sun brooch, as well as a Sequence 7 Werewolf's Beyonder characteristic. I made quite a killing this time. It's just a pity that I didn't manage to obtain the Zombie Beyonder characteristic.
Klein sat by the side of the dining table. As he ate, he did a tally of his spoils. What made his heart ache was the fact that he had used a total of 11 Beyonder bullets, each worth nearly 10 pounds.
That is to say, I burned 100 pounds. It's really like throwing money to deal damage. It's no wonder most low and mid-sequence Beyonders are so desperate for money.
Klein glanced down at his breakfast. They added up to only a few pence. After breakfast, Klein idly read the newspapers, sneezing from time to time as he wiped his nose and mouth with a piece of tissue paper. As soon as the church bell stopped chiming at 8 o'clock, his doorbell rang. Klein wasn't surprised to see the reporter for the Daily Observer, Mike Joseph. The reporter, with beautiful blue eyes and a thin mustache, but with rather rough skin, took off his hat and greeted him. Then he went straight to the point.
Detective Moriarty, do you have time to take the job?
Although he had a cold, he still needed to take on jobs like usual to avoid suspicion from anyone during this period of time. Klein, who had just finished a job, smiled and said,
I'm slightly ill, but that doesn't affect my fighting or shooting skills.
Mike suddenly smiled and said,
Thank you for your help. Let's set off now. Detective Moriarty, have you had breakfast? I'll treat you. As your employer, I should be in charge of providing you your meals today.
Inviting me to breakfast?
Klein was startled.
I just finished eating. But I suggest you go to Eastborough to have breakfast there. That way, you can see a lot of things. I'll just need a cup of coffee when we're there.
No problem.
Mike pointed outside.
The carriage I hired is waiting.
Klein sized him up and said,
Sir, you'd better change into something a little worse. Otherwise, there will be lots of work for me.
Mike looked down at his tweed coat and said with some realization,
This is too eye-catching?
It is in Eastborough.
Klein pointed into his place.
I have some specially prepared clothes. We are about the same size.
Mike couldn't help but exclaim,
You really are a professional.
Professional criminal?
Klein lampooned. After changing into ordinary workers' clothes, the two boarded the carriage and headed for the outskirts of Eastborough. Achoo! Klein pulled out another piece of tissue paper, wiped his mouth and nose, and blew his nose. Since there was no trash can nearby, he folded the tissue paper properly and stuffed it back into his pocket. Klein pointed to the slightly greasy coffee shop at the corner of the street.
The food in this coffee shop is okay. Of course, this is relative to the residents of Eastborough.
He occasionally came here for breakfast whenever he spent the night at his one-bedroom apartment that was nearby.
Looks like it's a pretty good restaurant.
Mike didn't think it was a coffee shop. It was already past 9 o'clock, and there were very few customers in the coffee shop. Eastborough residents typically finished their breakfast at around 7 and began to work or to look for work. After accompanying Mike as he ordered stewed beef with potatoes, bread, and coffee, Klein looked around for a window seat. At that moment, he saw an acquaintance, the elderly man he had helped while pretending to be a journalist.
He was the one who brought me here in the first place. Why is he only having breakfast now?
As Klein thought, he turned to Mike and said,
You have an interviewee.
As he spoke, he carried his coffee cup to the tramp. Itetalon. The man was wearing the same thick jacket as before. His grizzled hair was oily, and his beard was obvious. However, he no longer looked tired, and his face was no longer as appallingly pale as before.
Good morning. We meet again.
Klein sat down across him and greeted him, noticing that his breakfast was black bread with a large cup of cheap tea that was worth 1 penny. The elderly man raised his head, took a close look, and said in pleasant surprise,
Mr. Reporter, it's you?
Klein laughed dryly, pointed at Mike, and said,
This is my colleague. He wants to do a deeper investigation on my previous interview.
Being an experienced and knowledgeable reporter, Mike didn't say anything further when he heard that. All he did was nod with a smile and greeted the elderly man. As for the matter of Detective Moriarty pretending to be a reporter, it wasn't like he had only found out about it today. He was the one who had lent him his fake reporter's identification.
So you really are a reporter.
The elderly man blurted out in astonishment.
But that doesn't stop you from being a kind-hearted person.
Klein smiled and asked,
How have you been recently?
The elderly man drank a mouthful of tea and said,
Thanks to your help, I finally had a good night's sleep and ate my fill, so I wasn't that weak. My original plan was to go back to my original job, making shoes, but they didn't want me. They said my hands shook.
He lowered his head and chuckled, skipping that episode.
Later, I went down to the docks and found some work. It was tiring, but at least I made money. I've already rented a spot in someone's house for only 6.5 pence a week. Of course, I can only sleep there at night. Hedruck. Well, that's how working at the dock is like. I went early today and ate nothing. I raised my hand and shouted my name and the supervisor's name, but I wasn't chosen, so I had to come back here. Fortunately, there's still a chance in the afternoon. Those people in the morning might be busy till late and won't be fighting against us for those jobs.
Klein listened quietly, occasionally taking a sip of the bad coffee. As for Mike, He took out a pen and paper and quickly made notes. Chapter 353. Today is quite different from yesterday. Finally, the elderly man with gray hair by his temples took a sip of tea and sighed with a smile.
In truth, this is already much better than my previous situation, and it's much better than many of the people here. For instance,
He pointed out the window to the tramps huddled in a corner. Klein and Mike looked over and saw a group of cowering tramps lying on the ground in a filthy place that provided shelter from the wind. They were of all sexes and ages. It was possible for them to never wake up again in the coldness of late autumn. It was then that Klein noticed an old woman in her 60s standing by the street. Her dress was old and worn, but she was relatively neat, and her hair was neatly trimmed. The white-haired old lady had the usual tired look of a tramp, but she still persisted in not squeezing together with the group. Instead, she slowly walked by the roadside, occasionally gazing into the coffee shop numbly. The former tramp who had eaten the leftover black bread also noticed the old lady and sighed.
she's also a pitiful person. She was said to have led quite a good life in the past. Her husband was a grain merchant and had a very spirited child. But unfortunately, he went bankrupt, and her husband and child died not long after. She's different from us, really, and you can tell at a glance. Sigh. She won't be able to hold on much longer, unless she's lucky to be admitted into the workhouse every time.
As he listened, Mike's expression changed from quiet to somber. He slowly let out a sigh and said,
I want to interview her. Can you invite her for me? She can eat and drink whatever she wants here.
The man wasn't surprised by this request. He merely looked at Klein and Mike separately, as if to say, the both of you are indeed colleagues.
Yes, I'm sure she would like that.
He drank his tea, got up, and walked out of the greasy coffee shop. Not long after, the elderly woman in her old but tidy dress followed him in. Her pale face slightly lightened thanks to the warmth of the coffee shop. She continued to tremble, as if she wanted to release the coldness in her body, bit by bit, and absorb the relatively high temperature within the coffee shop. Even after she sat down on the chair, it still took her a full minute before she could truly warm up.
You can order whatever you want. This is the reward for accepting this interview.
After Mike nodded, the old lady modestly ordered toast, low-quality cream, and coffee. Then she smiled and said,
I heard that one cannot eat greasy food after not having eaten in a while.
Very polite. Very self-restrained, not like a tramp at all.
Klein sighed silently. Before the food arrived, Mike asked casually,
Can you talk about how you became a tramp?
The old lady revealed a look of reminiscence and said with a bitter smile,
My husband was a grain merchant who mainly bought all kinds of grain from domestic farmers, but we rapidly went bankrupt ever since the Grain Act was repealed. He wasn't very young to begin with. After suffering that setback, his body quickly collapsed. Not long after, he passed away. My child, a brilliant young man, had been learning the ropes of doing business from his father. He couldn't suffer the blow, and he ended up jumping into the Tussock River on a moonless night. His first suicide didn't work. He was sent to the magistrate's court, and the police and judges were very impatient, feeling that he was wasting their time. If you want to commit suicide, please do so quietly and successfully. Don't trouble us. Yes, that was probably what they wanted to say, but they found it too direct. My child was put in prison. Not long after, he committed suicide for the second time and succeeded.
The old lady spoke very calmly, as though it wasn't something that had happened to her, but for some reason, Klein felt a deep sense of sorrow.
Nothing is more lamentable than a dead heart.
He suddenly recalled the saying he had heard in his previous life. In this world, suicide was not only prohibited by the churches, but it was a punishable crime. As for the reason, Klein knew very well why. First of all, many suicides were committed by jumping into a river, and without being discovered in time, there was a certain probability of them turning into a water ghost. Second, the suicider often had very abnormal emotions. Thus, under such states, ending their lives was equivalent to a sacrificial offering, which could resonate with particular strange and terrifying existences. Thus, their corpses and certain objects that were around after them after their deaths would carry strange curses that harmed others. This was probably where the misfortune cloth puppet behind Tingen City's Chanis Gate came from. Therefore, the 7 Orthodox churches forbade their believers from committing suicide through their own doctrine, and the royal family also promoted the corresponding legislation. Of course, this seemed ridiculous to Klein.
How could a suicider be afraid of punishment by the law?
While Mike was taking notes, he was about to say something when the owner of the coffee shop brought the food over.
Fill your stomach first. We'll talk later.
Mike pointed to the toast.
All right.
The old lady ate the food in small bites, appearing very cultured. Having not ordered much, she quickly finished her meal. After reluctantly drinking the last mouthful of coffee, she rubbed her temples and pleaded,
Can I get some sleep first? It's too cold outside.
No problem.
Mike answered without hesitation. The old lady thanked him gratefully a few times before she sat down on the chair and curled up into a ball as she fell asleep. Mike looked at the man beside him and said,
You seem to be very familiar with this place. I wish to hire you as our guide. How's 3 solely for the day? I'm sorry, I forgot to ask for your name.
The man quickly shook his head and said,
No, that is too much. I only earn 1 solely a day most of the time at the dock. Just call me Old Kohler.
Then, 2 solely a day. You deserve it.
Mike decided firmly. After witnessing this strange bargaining, Klein blew into a piece of tissue and was about to drink another cup of coffee when he suddenly sensed that something was wrong. He turned to look at the old lady who was curled up, asleep on the chair. Her face, which had turned ruddy due to the coffee, was pale again. The colors of her aura and moods had vanished. Klein stood up and subconsciously extended his hand to check the old lady's breathing. As Mike and Kohler looked at him in surprise, he said heavily,
She's dead.
Mike opened his mouth, but no words came out. Kohler tapped his chest thrice and said with a bitter smile,
I knew she wouldn't be able to hold on for long. Such things happen every day in East Borough. At least she filled her stomach and died in a warm place. I hope it will be the same for me in the future.
Klein was silent for a moment before he said,
Kohler, go and get the police.
All right.
Kohler tapped his chest thrice once more and ran out of the coffee shop. The boss glanced over but didn't come over. It was as though it wasn't something he needed to concern himself with. After a while, a policeman in a black and white checkered uniform, carrying a baton and revolver, entered the coffee shop. He looked at the dead old lady, asked Mike and Klein a few questions. Then he waved his hand and said,
That's all there is to this. The 3 of you can leave after I get someone to collect the corpse.
That's it?
Mike blurted out in surprise. He was obviously not very familiar with East Borough. The policeman sneered.
Such incidents happen in large numbers every day in East Borough.
He rolled his eyes and looked at Klein and Mike.
You don't look like people from around here. Who are you? What's your identity?
Mike produced his press identification, and Klein said that he was a private detective responsible for protecting him. The policeman's face turned serious as he looked at Klein and said,
I suspect that you're carrying a gun illegally. I want to search your belongings. Please cooperate with me, otherwise it will be considered a case of resisting arrest.
Mike was suddenly worried because he knew that private detectives were usually unlawfully possessing firearms. Klein expressionlessly spread out his hands.
All right.
He let the policeman search him, but nothing was found on him. After the old lady's corpse was taken away, the disappointed policeman left. Mike clenched his fist and pounded on the table.
A living person just died here, yet all he cares about is investigating the unlawful possession of firearms?
Upon saying this, Mike looked at Klein and asked, puzzled,
You didn't bring a gun?
Klein shook his head, pulled out his holster and revolver from under the table, and said calmly,
As a detective, I have a lot of experience in this area.
As a magician, he could place the revolver right in front of someone and make it impossible for the person to notice it. Moreover, since he didn't buy any ordinary bullets, the Beyonder bullets were temporarily left above the gray fog. His revolver was currently empty, but this didn't stop him from shooting with his revolver. All he needed to do was to use his mouth to emulate a bang when he pulled the trigger. Upon seeing this, Old Kohler whispered from the side.
So you're a detective.
Klein pointed at Mike and casually explained.
I was also entrusted with a mission by this gentleman the last time as well.
Mike sat there without refuting. After a moment of silence, he said,
Although I've investigated the gangs and witnessed the miserable life of some prostitutes, I'm not familiar with the situation in East Borough. Please help me open my eyes to this place, allowing me to see if there are any problems with this investigation plan.
As he spoke, he took a few sheets of paper from the inside pocket of his clothes and spread them out on the coffee shop table. Klein glanced at him.
Interviews with East Borough residents of different ages? That's too troublesome. I think we can divide it according to location. In better apartments, 5 or 6 people squeeze into a one-room apartment. Others stay in the corner of a street that's sheltered from the wind, park benches, bars, and workhouses. In addition, they can be segregated by what time they begin work and when their rest times are.
Mike listened carefully and nodded.
Not a bad idea. What do you think, Kohler?
Old Kohler pinched his nose and said,
I can't read. But I think whatever Mr. Detective said seems all right.
Mike thought about it, changed his plan, and said,
Then let's go to a nearby apartment and make a random selection.
Chapter 354, Tales of an Adventure in East Borough. Backland's East Borough at an intersection. Mike Joseph saw a number of pitiful-looking children in rags along the street. He wiped his mouth with a handkerchief and planned to head over to give them some pennies. However, his action was stopped by the former tramp, Old Kohler.
They're thieves.
Thieves? What about their parents? Or are they controlled by the gangs?
As a senior journalist, Mike had never been to the East Borough, but he had heard of instances of a few gangs controlling street children to steal and beg.
Parents? They either don't have parents, or their parents were once thieves, or might still be thieves. Of course, Mr. Reporter, you're right, many of them are under the control of gangs, and it's said that the gangs will teach them how to steal. For example, they will hang a gentleman's coat on a wall, put a handkerchief in the pocket, and hang a pocket watch on the outside, and through repeated practice, the children will attempt to steal the handkerchief without shaking the pocket watch. Heh. This is what I heard from others while at the workhouse when I was homeless.
Old Kohler babbled on.
I remember the youngest thief ever caught on this street was only 6 years old. Sigh, 6 years old.
He seemed to recall his child who was lost to a disease and couldn't help but take out a cigarette from his pocket. He couldn't bring himself to smoke it, so all he did was take a sniff.
6 years old.
Mike was stunned by this number. Klein quietly listened and sighed.
This is East Borough.
He looked around, composed himself, and said,
This place is closer to the jungle than to human society. Our interview has to be treated as an adventure. You have to learn how to avoid the territory of dangerous creatures, but you must also avoid those little things that don't seem to be too harmful to you. Well, I'm talking about mosquitoes in the jungle. Mike, if you expose the thickness of your wallet to those kids, then even if you protect it well and don't let them steal it, robbery is a destined outcome during the rest of the adventure. If you dare to resist, then perhaps there will be one more body floating in the Tussock River tomorrow morning.
Mr. Detective, you're absolutely right. There are so many people in East Borough. No one pays notice to the few missing people every day.
Old Kohler agreed. Mike listened intently for a few seconds, and after a few seconds of silence, he suddenly said,
1.35 million.
Huh?
Because of his cold, Klein's throat was obviously a little hoarse. Mike stepped forward and said,
This is a preliminary estimate of the population count of East Borough, but I know that there's definitely more than that.
That many?
Old Kohler was startled. Although he had experienced the days and nights in East Borough and knew that there were a lot of residents here, he didn't expect there to be this many.
This is several times the population of Tianjin City.
Klein subconsciously compared it with the place that was most familiar to him. He looked at the intersection a few steps away and asked,
Which way should we go next?
Old Kohler looked up and said,
Definitely not straight. That area is under the control of the Zimanker gang. They're very vicious and completely unreasonable. If they discover any reporters doing interviews, then they'll definitely beat us up.
The Zimanker gang? Isn't that the brainless gang that caused me to lose 10,000 pounds? He was some kind of executioner. I don't even remember his name. Fortunately, the 10,000 pounds was eventually exchanged for the Sears corresponding sequence 7, 6, and 5 potion formulas and the all-black eye, as well as the Intis ambassador's life. I wonder who ended up obtaining the manuscript of the third-generation difference engine.
Klein instantly recalled what had happened early last month.
Zimanker gang? The gang that is mainly composed of Highlanders?
Mike asked thoughtfully.
Mr. Reporter, have you heard of them?
Old Kohler asked in surprise. Mike sneered.
They're involved in a lot of cases, and they have some reputation outside Eastborough as well. It's said that one of the members was involved in a case of Intis espionage.
The person next to you was the person in question, the person who made the report, and also the victim.
Klein silently added,
If you gentlemen know about the Zimanker gang, then why doesn't the police arrest them?
Old Kohler asked from his viewpoint of someone at the bottom of society. Mike's expression suddenly turned a little awkward, and he coughed twice.
We can only capture those who have committed crimes. There is no evidence for the rest, so we can't arrest them. Moreover, Eastborough is so broad, and there are so many people, it would be hard to find anyone who is bent on hiding.
As he spoke, he sighed.
It's easy to destroy one Zimanker gang, but as long as a Highlander comes to Backland, and if they keep up their strong tradition of being combative while failing to find any other means of earning a living, it's only a matter of time before a new Zimanker gang appears.
This is a complex social issue.
Klein pointed to the left and right.
Pick one.
Old Kohler looked at the right side of the street.
That's where the Proscrito gang is active. As long as we don't provoke the girls who do business on the streets or in the bars, they won't notice us. Heh, it's still morning, so there shouldn't be any problems. They're still sleeping.
The word proscrito meant outlaw in the Loan language, so it could be said that the gang who gave itself such a name was pretty self-aware. Klein and Mike had no objection to this, and with the guide leading the way, they entered the district. The buildings here were relatively better. The streets were less squalid, and the air was filled with the smells of oyster soup, fried fish, ginger beer, and the smell of various food and beverages left behind by street vendors, as well as the fishy smell of fish-related products. While walking here, Klein felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity. It was as if he had returned to Tianjin City, to Iron Cross Street, and to the street outside the apartment where he had originally lived in. The only difference was that Backland was closer to the sea and had more traffic. There was a lot more fish.
This is a relatively good apartment in this area. Back when I loitered around here, I discovered that the gentlemen and ladies inside are all, quite clean.
Old Kohler pointed to a pale yellow 3-story building. As they got closer, they noticed a sign hanging in front of the apartment. It had a picture of a pocket watch, a clock, and a screwdriver with the words, "Watch Repair."
A watch craftsman lives here?
Klein dug up a similar scene from the memory fragments of the original Klein. Back then, Benson, Melissa, and himself had gone to somewhere similar to repair the silver pocket watch which his father had left behind, but despite repairing it several times, it would quickly break. This continued until Melissa fiddled with it and ultimately fully repaired it. It became the most decent thing on Klein's person during that period of time. After Klein's death, the pocket watch, which had both monetary and sentimental value, was not buried with him.
It should now belong to Benson, right? I wonder if he will think of me every time he takes out that pocket watch.
Klein suddenly blinked and curled the corner of his lips.
Probably.
Mike wasn't sure. If anything went wrong with his pocket watch, it was usually sent to the original watch store he bought it from. The store would then send it to a repairman or to a craftsman who had partnered with them. As soon as they entered the apartment, they saw a middle-aged man with a messy beard. The gentleman had just come out of the bathroom and was about to return to his room. When he saw the three strangers come in, he hurriedly asked,
"Do you want to repair something?"
What a coincidence. We actually met the craftsman immediately.
Klein was slightly puzzled. Mike took out his pocket watch, smiled, and said,
Yes, my pocket watch has recently not been keeping time well. Can you help me take a look?
He didn't reveal his identity and planned to interview him over some casual chit-chat. The middle-aged man immediately revealed a smile and led them into a two-bedroom apartment which had its door half concealed. He pointed at a chair beside the table and said,
"Please wait a moment. I'll go get my tools."
Your tools are not at home?
Mike asked in surprise. The watch craftsman shook his head and laughed.
How is that possible? A set of tools is very expensive. There's no way I can buy them on my own. The only way is to pool everyone's money together to buy 3 or 4 sets, and whoever has business will use them. So we moved in together. Hey, it's more convenient this way. If we live too far away, we will have to spend extra time and pay for the public carriage to borrow the tools.
As he spoke, he left the room and walked to the side.
So it isn't a coincidence that we met a watch craftsman. Many of the residents here are of this profession.
Klein was suddenly enlightened. Old Kohler looked around the room and enviously said,
Before I fell ill, I lived in such a place as well. My wife would help others sew clothes at home. And my two children.
Mike sighed and lowered his voice.
I thought watch craftsmen were rich.
Me too.
Klein covered his mouth. After a cordial exchange with several of the apartment's residents, Klein and the others once again embarked on their adventure. They had walked about 100 meters when they heard people quarreling along the street. The two women were using all sorts of obscenities against each other, allowing Klein to learn many words he had never heard before. The reason for their argument was that the one on the left accused the woman on the right for making the apartment they lived in dirty and noisy. The woman on the right was scolding the woman on the left, thinking that it had nothing to do with her. After all, no one asked her to recruit guests at night and sleep during the day.
Is that a laundry maid?
Mike asked, frowning slightly.
Yes, I know her. She's a widow, helping people wash their clothes with her 2 daughters.
Old Kohler answered certainly. Mike thought for a few seconds and said,
Take me to their place.
Old Kohler nodded and led the two of them around the argument before they entered the dilapidated apartment building that was obviously inferior to the one they had just seen. As soon as he arrived outside the laundrymaid's room, Klein immediately felt the dampness. In the room hung dresses that were not dried yet. A 17 or 18-year-old girl was squatting in front of a large basin, scrubbing clothes that were covered in bubbles. A girl that was younger than her was holding a hot iron wrapped in wet linen cloth. She was carefully ironing the clothes that were done washing and drying. Her careful actions implied that she had been scalded by the steam several times. This was both their workplace and the place where they slept at night. Wet moisture permeated the room and seeped into their bodies. In addition, the stench of all kinds of smells was very distinct.
Doesn't it feel terrible?
Mike pinched his nose. Klein replied in a muffled voice,
I've got a cold.
There was no humor in his words. Mike released his fingers, walked into the room, and said to the two surprised girls,
I'm a reporter. I would like to interview a laundrymaid.
The girl who was scrubbing the clothes shook her head numbly and said,
We have a lot of things to do and cannot afford to waste time.
Mike's request for an interview was rejected. He came out with a heavy expression and silently walked back across the street. After taking a look, he pursed his lips and said,
Let's continue.
City of Silver. After a thorough examination of Derek Berg, who had experienced hallucinations both visually and auditory, he was brought to the bottom of the spire. This place took in residents who showed signs of losing control, and various methods were used to save them. Walking in the gloomy and creepy corridor, he suddenly felt a strange chill.
Help!
A sharp, shrill voice suddenly sounded from a sealed room.
Help!
The voice came to a sudden halt, and then there was silence. Chapter 355, Outsider. This. In the eerie silence, the first thought Derek Berg had when he came back to his senses was to rescue that person. However, the two guards that held him in the middle did not show any reaction to it, as if everything that had just happened was just his imagination. The young Derek informed the two Dawn Paladins.
Someone is calling out for help.
On his left, a tall knight clad in silver armor calmly replied,
Do not be fooled. That is just the normal behavior of those beyonders who are on the verge of losing control.
Is that so? Maybe he cried out for help because he just is not willing to give up and lose control and become a monster?
Derek thought sorrowfully. Following the change in his mood, the illusory, buzzing sound in his ears became more distinct. After silently taking a few steps forward, the Dawn Paladin from before pointed to a door on the left and said,
You will be staying here for the time being. We will bring you your food and medicine on time.
As he spoke, he took out an iron-black bottle. This bottle was constructed from the remnants of the straw-like objects left over from the City of Silver's staple food, black-faced grass. Upon encountering a liquid, it would produce a thin film, thereby achieving a waterproof and sealing effect. Derek took the bottle and gulped it down, feeling a cool sensation slide down his esophagus and into his stomach. His entire being rapidly became quiet. The swaying scenes before his eyes stabilized, and the auditory hallucinations in his ears gradually weakened. Creak! At the sound of the iron door closing and locking, Derek entered his own room. The first thing he saw was a candle flickering with a faint yellow light, and then he made out a low bed, a chair, and a square table. Other than that, there was nothing else. However, the walls, including the door, were all engraved with complicated and mysterious symbols and labels. They seemed to form a complete seal. Derek's emotions were also suppressed by the medicine. He sat down on the bed without the slightest hint of curiosity before lying down. After an unknown period of time, he suddenly heard the sound of someone banging on his door. However, this did not come from outside his room, but from his neighboring cell. Derek sat up and listened. He heard a sharp, high-pitched wail from the knocking. His hair stood on end as he abruptly stood up, taking an extremely defensive stance. At this moment, thumping sounds spread to the metal walls that were separated by two rooms, slowly smashing a protrusion. Derek was about to pray for holy light when the scene before his eyes suddenly lit up. It seemed as if the entire space around him had been moved to the outside world, just in time for the lightning to streak past. The sound of the wall being smashed beside him had vanished, and the bottom of the spire regained its silence. It was not an absolute silence. Rather, the sound of light footsteps echoed for a long distance. It only turned silent after the echoes continued on for a long time. Derek was wondering what had happened to the Beyonder in the neighboring cell when someone knocked on the metal wall on the other side. Tack, tack, tack. It was as if someone had bent their finger and was tapping lightly.
Who is it?
Derek asked, raising his voice in slight alarm. The knocking immediately stopped, and after a few seconds, a deep, yet rather old voice was faintly transmitted.
So it turns out to be a young fellow.
You are?
Seeing that the other person could communicate rationally, Derek leaned against the wall and pressed his ear against the cold metal. The elderly voice chuckled and said,
The person next to you almost lost control several times. He ultimately could not be saved today.
He completely lost control? Derek asked through the metal wall.
So he has become a monster now?
The elderly voice sighed.
No, not a monster, but a corpse. He was finished off by the items sealed in here. I have been here for 42 years. Yes, those guards told me that they have seen too many similar incidents.
You have been here for 42 years?
Derek was surprised and returned with a question. Normally speaking, losing control could be divided into 3 stages. The first stage was warning signs, such as auditory and visual hallucinations. In the second stage, the person's body and mind were already out of control, and from time to time, they would display either terrifying or strange states. As for the third stage, it was a complete breakdown, transforming the rampager into a terrifying monster. The time it took from the second stage to the third stage was rather quick. Perhaps just after discovering the symptoms, one would witness a seemingly ordinary beyonder turn into a monster which could be found deep in the darkness. In other words, after a second stage beyonder was sent to the bottom of the spire, they would either be treated with medicine, rituals, and other methods, slowly stabilizing themselves and allowing them to leave within 18 months. Otherwise, they would quickly lose control and be purged. It was impossible for anyone to be locked up for 42 years. As a first-stage beyonder, they would only take between a few days to less than 20 days to eliminate all the symptoms and leave, fully treated. The elderly voice immediately chuckled and said,
That is right. I also did not expect that I would stay here for 42 years. I do not have any signs of losing control, but they believe I am rather dangerous and can turn into a monster at any time.
What happened 42 years ago?
Derek frowned slightly and asked curiously. At that time, neither of his parents had been born yet. The elderly voice was silent for a moment before saying,
I was once the captain of an exploratory team. We found a destroyed city about half a month away from the City of Silver. This was calculated based on our speed. That city was similar to our City of Silver. It clearly has traces of it being ruled by giants, and it also believed in the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God. Unfortunately, they were destroyed countless years ago.
Derek was not a stranger to such matters. He immediately guessed.
Because you encountered some strange incidents there, you were determined to be at risk of losing control?
The elderly voice chuckled.
More or less. After we explored the core area, we discovered that the city was attempting to change faiths. They created deities that they imagined would save them. However, it was useless. Even the statues of those deities were destroyed and spilled all across the land.
At this point, his tone suddenly became heavy.
However, we met a person there. This is the first time in the past 2,000 years that our City of Silver had met someone who did not belong to our city. Outside City of Silver, in the depths of the endless darkness, there really was someone still alive.
You brought him back to the City of Silver?
Derek subconsciously asked. The elderly voice said after 2 seconds,
Do not you feel shocked? The reason why our City of Silver works so hard to explore the surroundings is to find humans like us. We finally found them 42 years ago.
This is indeed rather shocking news, but I often see Miss Justice, Mr. Hangman, and the others. I often hear of the Lowen Kingdom and the 7 Orthodox gods. Is not it very obvious that there are people outside the City of Silver, with cities and countries?
Derek scratched his head, and without much experience, he pretended to be shocked.
I did not notice this point. This is truly unbelievable. Other than the residents of the City of Silver, there are actually other people.
The elderly voice remained silent for a while before saying,
Has the City of Silver's education become so terrible?
Without waiting for Derek to speak, he sighed and said to himself,
We very warily invited that person to the City of Silver as a guest. After some consideration, he agreed. We monitored and escorted him along the way back. But when we had almost arrived at the City of Silver, he suddenly disappeared. We searched everywhere, but we could not find him. After we returned to the City of Silver, my team members went crazy, one by one. They lost control, all of them. Not a single one was spared. The 6-member council suspected that we were contaminated by something, and that the person was not a human at all, but an evil spirit, a monster. So they locked me up here, and every so often they would come over to confirm my condition, but they would never tell me what the problem is, nor would they let me out.
Do you remember what that man looked like?
Derek exhaled heavily and asked. The elderly voice recalled for nearly a minute and said with a bit of pain,
He looked very ordinary, and nothing about him stood out. He was dressed just like us, and except for me remembering that he was a man, I cannot remember what he looked like. However, the elders should be able to use Beyonder means to directly see him from my vague, forgotten memories.
Did he say what his name was? Did he tell you about his origins?
Derek pressed him, casually. The elderly voice acknowledged tersely.
He told us that his name was
He paused for a moment before saying,
Amon.
Sunday morning in the factory district. In the past 2 days, Klein and Mike visited many places in Eastboro under Old Kohler's guidance. As a result, Mike witnessed 5 or 6 people huddled together in a single room, and that was not the worst case he saw. In the poorest areas of Eastboro, an ordinary bedroom could accommodate 10 people. The precise division of the right to use the floor and the time of use, day or night, shocked the reporter. Moreover, poverty did not discriminate between men and women. In those places, people of different genders squeezed in tight spaces without being able to abide by societal norms. Certain incidents which deserved time in court happened all the time. Whether it was men or women, all of them were always facing the threat of violence. Mike wrote in his investigation manuscript,
Squalid, crowded, smelly. That is the most objective impression. I suspect that every one of them has a serious problem of having parasites. Because the houses were built a long time ago in the most run-down districts, they are not connected to the sewers. Feces, urine, vomit, and other things can be found everywhere. Every house here only has one public bathroom, or worse, every street only has one public toilet. They are extremely busy every day, but they can only barely fill their stomachs without any savings. As long as they are unemployed for a few days, they will fall into an irredeemable abyss. I do not think they would even be afraid of death if they were given even a little hope.
In addition, the reporter was impressed by the tramps who wandered the streets in the middle of the night, the girls who stood numbly by the street or in the bars, as well as the drinkers who completely let loose with their drinking. They did not hold back on using violence and did not consider the future. All of this left a deep impression on this reporter. He grew more and more silent.